Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Random podcast. I'm your host, Peter Bauman, the editor-in-chief at Random. And today we have an extra special episode as a companion to the newly released London Digital Art Guide at Random. But this is the real juicy insider stuff today. It's our writers' roundtable from the guide. And so we brought together most of the contributors and the writers, and we are going to chat with them about all things London and London digital art. So those contributors are the curator and producer, Hannah Redler-Hawes, curator and writer, Clara Pe, the artist and author, Robert Alice, and art historian and curator, Abigail Miller. It's such a wonderful panel. These are also the people that I handpicked to write the guide and co-write the guide with me. So I couldn't be more grateful. Hannah is a UK-based curator and producer. She has over 2 decades of experience in museums, senior management roles. Clara is a London-based curator who founded NFT Asia. Robert Alice, besides being a great artist who investigates blockchains and its history and who's been collected by the Pompidou and LACMA, is also, of course, the author of Taschen's on NFTs. We are also so lucky to have Abigail Miller, who is at Avant Art and is doing yeoman's work there, building art and technology for them. These great contributors to our guide are joining me today so that we can unpack the digital art scene in London and also talk about how you as a visitor can make the most out of your trip. What they really seemed to emphasize was the intimate and collaborative nature of London's digital art scene. And we also discuss how you as a visitor can explore its more underground, less known places beyond the traditional gallery spaces. So we have a lot to talk about. We have a whole city to discuss, and it's one of the most important in the world for digital art. So I can't wait. I'm so excited. Let's begin. I just want to say, of course, thank you all so much for participating in the guide and writing for the guide and now joining us here for this discussion about the guide. And I would just kind of like to know, to get started, what your takeaways and what you learned from writing your sections of the guide. And maybe we can start with, we'll go section by section with the guide. So we'll start with the introduction. And we were so lucky to have Hannah Redler-Hawes write our introduction along with Alex Estrick. And unfortunately, Alex couldn't make it today, but he co-wrote the piece very graciously with Hannah. And I think, if I'm honest, you probably had one of the harder tasks, Hannah, I think, to write the introduction. I think it's really difficult to put all of this into context and to set the scene, but I think you did a really wonderful job providing that context and writing a little bit about the history and also just being honest about the scene and its history in London and that, relative to other parts of the UK. So yeah, just can you tell us a little bit about your experience writing it, and then what were some of your takeaways and what you learned from writing the introduction?
I think the experience of writing it was a case of thinking, how do we throw a net around the enormous range of practice that we've had in London in the digital arts field, from the 1960s onwards, and what do we choose to reflect? Obviously, we've not included everything. You can't include everything in 700 words, but we wanted to give a sense of some of the key milestones and sort of marker moments, flags in the sand, if you like. And we also wanted to show respect to some of the really important things that have happened that might not be visible any longer. And then we wanted to choose things that would feed into what visitors can see, because obviously this isn't a historical document. This is a guide for people to come and experience London today. And we really wanted people to feel that they could see that they were becoming part of that when they become visitors here. I mean, what did I learn? I guess it reinforced that sense that this has been a really, really far-reaching, mixed, multidisciplinary and diverse ecosystem that has been fed by all sorts of practitioners, many of which have been outside the mainstream art world. I mean, I trained in mainstream, fine art, painting and curating contemporary art, but I moved into media art, and I met people who were coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, and the organizations that were supporting this field, in the sort of early 90s when I started working in the field were not necessarily art organizations. So the mainstream art world has only very, very recently started to support this work. And a lot of that's to do with the fact that artists are just naturally using digital technologies because it's the material of, the everyday today.
Yeah, one thing that struck me when we had our kind of preliminary talk for this guide was you were telling me about how the London scene has really changed and how a lot of these spaces that were really prominent in previous decades have closed. And the other thing that struck me was that just London's place relative to the rest of the UK wasn't always necessarily the center of digital art. And I wonder if you could say anything more about those two things.
Yeah. So I was trying to think about the first digital art I saw in London, and that was probably at a gallery that I don't think exists anymore called Camera Works. And that was the curator Helen Sloan had curated work with Tessa Elliott and Jonathan Jones Morris, who are pioneering British artists who don't have a high profile any longer. But, they were writing AI artworks in the 1990s. But actually, the places where I saw the most work in the UK were at Moviola, which was a festival that fed into what is now FACT Liverpool in Liverpool, and Root Festival, Hull Time-based Arts. And so the festival community has been absolutely essential to the media art world that we see in London. That's what fed a lot of the huge installations that people were able to make because they had residencies, because they had support through the festival circuit as well.
It's fascinating, and I think you and Alex did a really wonderful job with the introduction, and yeah, I can't wait for everybody else to read it. And we can move on to Clara. And Clara, you wrote maybe one of the, well, I don't know, I guess it all just depends, but I think one of the funner sections of the guide, which is thinking about sort of actually planning a trip and that the excitement of that. And you wrote about the trip planning section, when to go, where to stay, a little bit about the food, but always sort of keeping in mind that you're really there to see art, and especially digital art. I really appreciated in your work just how detailed it was, and I could tell that you were excited when you wrote it because it seemed dense, and I really appreciated that. And yeah, I just wondered if in the course of writing it, what you came across that was interesting, or maybe what some of the takeaways were, or what you learned.
Yeah, I definitely had a lot of fun going through the process. I think as soon as Peter, you reached out, I was like, let me start this right away, because I just knew I was going to have, a lot of fun and enjoyment working on it. And I think approaching sort of which neighborhoods to visit, I was also really intentional in sort of moving away from maybe places that people would already be thinking about, or areas with really high density of like museums, big institutions. So I chose to focus on two kind of areas where I think there are more up and coming or experimental programs, as well as more interdisciplinary kind of experiences. It was really great fun to also think about potentially introducing people to spaces that show, broader contemporary art, but that currently or oftentimes also have programs engaging with digital or new media or moving image. Yeah, so that was kind of how I approached it. Just really wanting to think about the broader relationship that much of the new media field today shares with wider contemporary art discourse, and how this guide or the routes that we're proposing could offer those insights.
When you were kind of looking at how to think about neighborhoods and a map of the city, did it happen naturally, or did you have to sort of like gerrymander what to do together? Like, how natural are these sort of neighborhoods and walks that you put together?
I just kind of did away with like traditional neighborhood labelings, I think, and I just went the first route that I suggested is between like Bethnal Green to Shoreditch, and I just listed a bunch of galleries that like I would go to, and that when I have friends visiting, I would take them to as places that I think show really interesting programs like Auto Italia, Cell Project Space, where you're looking at artists who are really producing new commissions and that may or may not be digital native, but that are often, I think, sort of going back to the point that Hannah was talking about, responding to maybe the digital condition that we're in, but also thinking about, sort of other galleries doing really important and interesting work. And then the second route I suggested was sort of going from Somerset House and then across the river to South Bank, where you have like, a plethora of things that you can experience. Like I love that area, so I just really wanted to recommend it. But also, I gave a special mention to the Mediatek in BFI, where you have that luxury of accessing so much of the collection, which includes a lot of material like early animation. So also thinking about digital art in its broader sense, and that relationship of different kinds of works on screens, maybe through a more film moving image perspective. But yeah, I think that was probably a lot of gerrymandering. But these are like walks that I would take. And I was also thinking about kind of accessibility in terms of length and how to reach these places, that these are sort of easy enough places to go to follow along, but that are also easy to drop out of if you are sick of art and you're ready to move on to something else.
I just asked because I did that section for the New York guide, and I really kind of felt like it was really tricky to kind of jigsaw everything together, and also New York is so dense too. So the New York Soho area, we did it, I think 3 different walks or something. But I think that was one thing that was really interesting about your section, was that you maybe subverted our expectations a bit by saying that Soho was the area to avoid, right?
On a weekend.
With the play.
I think that was a really tough question, because I was really like, I don't think there's anywhere that I would tell someone to avoid. And I think in my introduction, I also pointed out, like, I do think the broader art scene, but also the digital art space here is so diverse enough that when you're going to these different pockets, that you do get to see different parts of that conversation. So it's not that there's anywhere I wouldn't recommend someone going to or exploring, but personally I would avoid, like, I don't like crowds. And so that was the only thing I could think of, which is maybe a bit of a cop-out, but yeah.
It makes sense. I think that was basically the same reasoning for the New York guide. I think Museum Mile area, MoMA around Central Park was the place to avoid, and for pretty similar reasons.
Clara, can I ask what was in the walk from towards the South Bank?
Oh, so I suggested starting from Somerset House, where during especially like Frieze Week, you have like 154. And then there'll also be like the Somerset House studios like opening, and there's a party on the 17th. And then just going across the river to then like South Bank, Hayward Gallery, BFI, so on and so forth.
I'm going to do the walk.
Well, that's the thing. Like, so I kind of also helped put together the walks for New York, and I was like, this really makes me want to go to New York and do these walks.
Oh.
And now I feel the exact same thing about London. Is like, I really want to go and do these now.
Clara, you picked my favorite restaurant in London.
Well,
Your
neighborhood,
dumpling. Everyone should go there. It's banging. I love that place.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, that's really cool. I need to star that in my Google Maps.
Yeah.
But maybe we can go to you and talk about your section. So you have the section, I wouldn't call it the meat and potatoes, but this is really one of the heftier sections of the guide, where you talk about the actual galleries to go to and highlight specific ones that are digital focused, and of course also the museums. And so you looked at what to actually do when you're in London for a cheeky digital arts day. And I wonder if you could just tell us I really enjoyed that you were quite direct and honest. And I think that that's what visitors need. You know, they just need to know information. Like after putting this section together and kind of thinking about these are the digital spaces in London, I also wondered what some of your takeaways were and maybe what you learned like what was your process for deciding what to include and what to highlight?
Yeah, I kind of learned a lot. I think I kind of knew it already, but it was just like interesting to like actually confirm it. So the Tate you can just go on their website. It has 1,279 artworks on their walls, and only 13 of them are digital. So basically the thing that I kind of learned was like, there is this hidden depth of digital art in London, but it's really hard to find permanent displays of digital art year round. What that effectively means is like, it's kind of fun. It's like a little treasure hunt, and you get to go to these kind of small corners and have a kind of unique, intimate experience. But it says more about, I think, the state and status of digital art in London. All roads lead to the V&A, has one of the great collections of digital art in the world, but none of it's on view, which is frustrating. But the other side of it is like, if you're intrepid and you want to, you know, order ahead and set up a meeting and order artworks that you can see, you can go and curate your own little Wunderkammer for the afternoon in the V&A and see some amazing works, you know, holding white gloves. And that's a unique experience. Like, that's actually, like, to some extent, a more engaging experience than going to see a great show. And I think actually, to some extent, that kind of intimacy is really cool. Clara, I also added, for when I did add places to go for lunch, so we can discuss those. So yeah, I think, you know, there are lots of places that have done great digital shows, the Serpentine, 180 The Strand. The programming is not, you know, it's not year round. So it's very much kind of Google and find out. I have to say, like, I was quite disappointed with the Tate. I think they could do more. I think it's a shame. Yeah, I wrote, give it a protest vote, but, you know, you can choose whether to go or not, up to you. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of other, you know, smaller institutions, galleries that you can kind of guarantee seeing some digital art. I think Gazzelli in Mayfair is somewhere you can always guarantee seeing something, which I think is cool. Nagoon Wyatt now in Islington, I think is going to be a real kind of meeting point for the digital art community in a real way. I think that's really nice to like have a safe space in London that you can go to and, you know, you can have a conversation and and get pointed into, you know, into another direction. And then there are a few like little, like, I don't know, like Easter eggs, like, you know, you want to travel up to Finsbury Park, go and see Furtherfield. Like, if you really want to get into the roots of like, of the net art scene and like trade some war stories, go and speak to Ruth Catlow, who's just like a living legend. And so there are all these people, and I think the beauty of it is like, they're actually very accessible. You know, if you plan ahead, you're going to have a more intimate, personal experience than going to see some, you know, major retrospective with, you know, 1,000 other tourists. And that's kind of, I think that's kind of fun. It was fun thinking about it. It's fun to put it together. It kind of made me realize that, like, I think London still has a long way to go, and there's this sort of tension between how much digital art it has, but how little of it is on view. And yeah, think of it as a kind of treasure hunt and you'll have fun.
Can I just add to that? I think that's so fabulous, but one of the problems with there not being any permanent work on display does relate to the fact that this was a really marginalized field for a long time, and it's in the process of being canonized. But, you know, the Tate's earliest digital work were digital commissions for its internet, for the Tate's website. They weren't actually accessioned. And then Rafael Lozano Hema was, they purchased a work by him, but not as a digital or media artist, as a Latin American artist. And the Science Museum, where I led an art program for a really long time, I did purchase permanent installations, but they'd be up for 5 years. One was up for actually nearly 15 years, but they're not up now. And I don't know what the museum's plans are to show them again. They're really hard to show again. So that's all tricky.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And even what you write about in your piece about how all roads lead to the V&A and how much digital art it has, and also the kind of role that it's played in the history of collecting digital art with Douglas Dodds and Patrick Prince. And it's fascinating that it's just Corinna Gardner and part-time Melanie Lenz keeping it all together there.
No, it's kind of, yeah, it's sort of, it's this like iceberg with this quite like, it maybe requires more people to really kind of get it out.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe that's something a few of those topics I hope to touch on in this, maybe the second part of this conversation, which will be coming, where we discuss maybe the scene from a broader level. Well, let's wrap up this section with the writers and the writers' perspective on their wonderful work, with a guide with Abigail. Abigail, you had I think also pretty fun task, and I also did this for the New York Guide, of writing about the artist in London and any just kind of sense of what the different scenes are there. And then you also added a lot ad hoc and to the resources section. So yeah, can you just tell us a little bit about your contributions and what you learned by going about them?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a sentiment that's been repeated in this conversation from everyone here, is that London's like extremely diverse. And there are artists that come to mind like right away that are based here in London, especially in the generative art scene specifically, such as like Matt Desore and all these artists. But I wanted to go like a step further into like the wider art world of artists using technology, computer art, as well as digital. There's like a wide variety of artists that are coming out of, like goldsmiths, like really young artists that are getting a really good grasp of the British art scene, as well as they are certain older artists in their own right that have been using technology. So highlighting those that might not be as familiar to this community online that we are aware, as well as then a lot of contemporary artists, such as Robert Alice here, to Lawrence Leck, to Alexandra Daisy Ginsburg, that have been doing a lot of like institutional work across the board. And so like highlighting all those different factors and bringing them all in one place, as well as like in the ad hoc section, we've kind of touched on it, but like the resources of institutions. I think when people think of London, they automatically think of, the Serpentine, the Tate, and the V&A, which are doing such incredible things. But there's other research institutions that are doing a lot of important work, such as like Birkbeck, Oxford, and the OI Institute is doing incredible stuff with AI right now, and the researchers coming out of there, all the way to goldsmiths, and then just like wider researchers and curators that are doing their work with like the ICA to Barbican to South London Gallery. There's a lot of programming, I think, on a smaller scale with digital that is happening. And it just takes a guide like this to bring it all under one hood.
You did strike on a particular point, which is that this is something I definitely could never have done by myself, or I mean, I could have, but it would have been a joke. So, I mean, really, this had to be collaborative with people who know the scene way better than I do, who live there, who have years of experience or decades of experience there. And so, yeah, I mean, I so much appreciate everybody and what they contributed.
Yeah, and the last thing I think is also important, a lot of digital artists in their own right, like Emmeline to Adelanta Santi, are showing like, and Sadie Coles on the contemporary scene are showing like a lot of digital new media work of artists, as well as just like highlighting, I think, the students coming out of goldsmiths, maybe not on an individual level, but like getting people to those graduate shows, I think is really, really important. Even though this is a London guide, there's so many important artists that live outside of London, here in the UK, that is like also just as rich. And sometimes I think people think they live in London, but really they might be based in Bath or Manchester.
I think we can go on to the second section, and which is just about questions more general or more broadly speaking about the London digital art scene. And I think we've touched on a lot of them already, some of the interesting issues that London presents, or the greater UK. And especially for me, I'm thinking about how they're different from New York, but this is ultimately a London guide for visitors and for people who want to come and maybe enjoy art in the city, digital art. And I was just wondering, to kick it off, when you have friends visiting, and say this friend is some digital art obsessed person, what kind of itinerary or what kind of advice would you give a friend?
I think maybe this is a controversial take, and getting at this maybe coming from an American lens, living in London for like 6 years now. I always find Londoners and British people to be hosters. It is a city of like house parties compared to New York, where it's like things never sleep. So a lot of it is, again, repeated in this guide of like very intimate experiences, like going to the V&A and kind of like seeking that out specifically. And I think it's the same of like everyone, like if you reach out to Robert Alice, like he's gonna be like, come to my studio like immediately. And like those are kind of the experiences I think London really provides, is like those intimate spaces and conversations, as well as like just reaching out to, I think, everyone that's here. Everyone's so excited to get together. And when people come to town, I see people really rallying around that, alongside putting together like the itineraries.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that it's really important just to know who's in a place. And I even added that in the New York guide when I did the artist section, was that you could be lucky enough to get in touch with this person and do a studio visit. And yeah, you never know. I mean, obviously I'm not giving out their email addresses, but or Robert Alice might want to, if you're a really special person, show you around his studio. And
I'll have anyone. I'm a gun for hire. No, I actually, no, you know what? I actually think, like, I think that what always attracts me to the digital art scene, and also to the kind of the blockchain art world, is like everyone is a Twitter DM away. Doesn't really matter who you are, but if you have interest and you have the foresight to email ahead or send a DM ahead, then like message me and come for lunch. That's the fun. And if I'm here, you know, then for sure come. So yeah, I think that's the whole point. And that's what I would definitely say. Like, it's a bit like what Abigail said, like, you know, there are lots of artists working here. Just like go and see some artists. Like, that's the fun, you know? Or just go and message and say, hey, what have you seen in the last couple of weeks that you like? And so I'll message you and let you know. We're outside of the kind of haughty white cube for a reason.
Exactly. It's always been a social scene. And we've moved on from the point where everyone who was at Ars Electronica could fit on one bus. We probably need, like a fleet of buses and maybe a small island now. But it's about social networking as well. I guess I'd add to that I'd always encourage people to look at the public programs, like all of the museum lates, not just the obvious art museums, all of the museum lates, all of the public programming, because a lot of really experimental work, particularly work that museums and galleries can't afford to run for an exhibition period, will appear at these events. And you'll see a mix of artists, designers, researchers, tinkerers, hackers, and they're always up for a chat as well.
I also want to add that I think a sentiment that we're all kind of trying to get at is that, like, if I have to give advice to someone visiting who's digital art obsessed, is don't just look at the obvious places, right? Like, I think what we're all trying to say is there's actually a lot of, digital, or it could be moving image or kind of related work that is found in corners that maybe you didn't expect. They're often being shown in art galleries today. Like I mentioned, public galleries show right now, for example. But also, this is a hack if people don't know about it, but the Science Museum, like in South Ken, they have a really, really great section of video games from the 1960s to today. And they're all like, you just pay a day pass or an annual pass, and they're free to play. And so if you're interested in that history of video games or, games as art, including looking at the kind of hardware, the different kinds of consoles that accompany that history, that's actually such a wonderful resource. But it's not necessarily being packaged as like, oh, this is a place for digital art. But, it's something that I think anyone who's interested in digital art can look at and would have a great field day out of.
There's so much young programming on the gallery side. Like, I know so many digital artists, like really, really young, and like working with young curators that are just like honestly getting like an old school projector and getting friends around for beers at pubs and being like looking at art, because having a white cube space is so expensive. And there's a lot of that kind of scene and energy right now happening in London. A lot of people are talking about like the energy in the London contemporary art scene is something different in the last like year and a half that hasn't been felt like in decades. So there's things bubbling as well in like conversations, but it's very much, you just gotta talk to the people on the ground and being like, where are the meetups? Because it is such a social network, like Hannah has said.
That reminds me of the early days of Furtherfield, a projector in Mark and Ruth's front room, which was in a warehouse.
Yeah, sick. I do think that like everyone forgets that like Leo Real has basically painted every London bridge with an evening light show, digital art show. There is a very romantic date to be had, taking Lime bikes down the river and looking at each bridge and having a beer on each one. So I would just recommend that if it's not raining.
Or go whole London and rain. Enjoy the rain. Get an umbrella.
Yeah, exactly. Fuck it. Enjoy the rain.
Buy
Buy an umbrella.
Yeah.
That would be even more romantic.
Yeah.
What is my must do? And it would tie in perfectly with Clara's walking tour.
Don't expect to find digital art in art galleries. So, you know, look to all the other places, the science museums, the natural history museums, the really teeny tiny museums, because you just never know where something has been commissioned, you know, that you don't know. Like there's an amazing digital artist who's done tons of work with the Dickens Museum because she was researching Dickens' wife. You know?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I also think London is a great music scene as well that's very intertwined and like going out. And that's how I've like also experienced new media art, digital art, like in the most surprising ways. Like I was with friends at Dalston Superstore and they were showcasing like new video work from an artist. And I was like, this is the last place I was expecting on a Saturday night to be seeing an installation video that's like new that they've commissioned. And so it's like things like that is also, I think, super intertwined in London, is like the various scenes, music as well, techno.
My controversial recommendation is to go and protest the Tate and the V&A until they start buying blockchain art. I think it would be a very good use of your time. I think compared to New York and compared to Paris, I've done a lot of work in Paris, but compared to both cities, London, from an acquisitional point of view, is really far behind when it comes to blockchain art. And I think it's something that I'm trying to, whenever I speak to the powers that be, it's something I always try and push. But I do think that yeah, it's like it's a sort of elephant in the room. It's like, well, why hasn't London got its act together? Like, you know, the Pompidou is building one of the great collections of blockchain art. You know, the same, you know, the first thing you walk in, it's kind of crazy. The first major artwork you see when you walk into MoMA, like, you know, the headquarters for art in the world, is a 16-foot by 16-foot screen showing a blockchain artwork.
And for years.
For years now. Like, and so it's kind of it's kind of frustrating to see that like the Tate has an almost, there's been no even policy or no even kind of working group or thought or even articles. You know, MoMA for a year or so was writing about blockchain art and speaking to and interviewing people like Kevin McCoy before they started, you know, doing this. They had they even did a sort of small conference. Like they've kind of slowly dipped their toe into it, and this is the realization for it. And I actually think it's incredibly persuasive when you go into MoMA to see that screen, just for like the audience, like, and they don't even need to know that it's registered on blockchain. It's just a digital artwork. And
this is part of the entire history. The UK has been slow to support photography. Actually, it was slow to support video art. It was slow to support network art. I was able to purchase things for the Science Museum, which is for the National Collection. So it's digital art in the National Collection, because we had a team of engineers who could run the stuff, and the conservation was used to supporting digital and electronic media. And the Tate has started to purchase digital art and media art, but it's slow because of the conservation issues. And some of those questions are really good, but it's almost it's a British kind of mindset that we've just seen across every new new emergent media and form.
Yeah, and I think that's like, I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting. It's a cultural thing. Like, why is it happening in France, not here? And I think, you know, the reality is, as you talk about photography, like, you know, we're going to be in a situation, and maybe this is a bit controversial to say, but we're going to be in a situation in 30 years' time where, you know, how many shows are the Tate and the V&A going to do of Elton John's collection in this kind of like decade-long war to get the, you know, to get the collection once he dies? Like, that's the reason they're putting the show on. And so, you know, who is going to be the blockchain collector that they're going to do that to in 30 years' time, when people start kind of understanding that this is an important part of the cultural history of the 21st century?
Well, you've laid the gauntlet, they'll all be fighting now.
Well, exactly. I mean, they already are, and they've made that mistake. You know,
Exactly.
it's like every 2 years there's an Elton John show. It's an amazing collection, don't get me wrong, but like there is a subtext to that, and the same thing will play out maybe for blockchain-based work and digital art in 20 or 30 years' time.
I definitely agree. I think it also gets at to the landscape within London that's not much more on like the guide side, but like the development work with institutions is like a whole different landscape than I think compared to other cities of working within the very nonprofit space of London. And another kind of like section that I know Clara has worked in, I added a few institutions, but London is rich with nonprofit foundations like Delphina, different art foundations like Arbite, even the Camden Art Center. Those are all doing like incredible work and part of the network as well. And so part of getting these institutions to focus on digital art is getting patrons in and getting that development work there.
Yeah, totally. So if New York has MoMA, it has, you know, even Christiane at the Whitney and what Regina is doing at MoMI, it has these champions of blockchain art at institutions. What would be the closest approximation in London? Would it be Serpentine?
I think probably Serpentine, but I also think it needs to be highlighted, like being a curator in London is very different than being a curator in the US. Is I think one of the most noble causes, and I think it has, and as an American, both me and Clara graduated from Courtauld, which is only like art history. It's a very competitive field like across the globe, but in London, like you're starting at like 20K maybe, and that is like a very like
in the US you're getting paid a lot more.
Yeah, in the US you're getting a lot. You're getting a paid.
What do you get paid in the US as an entry curatorial role out of interest?
I mean, it depends like where you're based in the US as well. Like in Nebraska, it's like 80K. In
80K.
And in New York, it can be like 60K.
Well,
it's still not great.
Jesus,
but like,
guys, fighting the good fight.
It's not the best across the world. Like curatorial jobs are known for not being like,
yeah, they're not.
You know, Goldman Sachs jobs. And I think that's also like a really like needs to be noted of like, oh, we want more of these kind of programs, more of these people. Like they also need to be like equally supported in the ecosystems if we want to see a change, not just like us yelling into the black void of we need more digital art curators, but people who can actually take on this kind of work.
And also conservators. Go on, Clara.
Yeah, and conservators for sure.
I was just gonna say, I also think like just kind of the difference in the landscape, but even though we may not have as many people that we can like name off the top of our head who are within these institutions and being really loud sort of champions of digital art from this specific corner, but I do think there are a lot of curators who are engaging with artists working in technologies, who are maybe just bought like contemporary art curators, but who have that sensitivity, who have that curiosity, and who are, you know, really like, yeah, with artists. So even though I think it appears so that it's kind of harder to find those specific pinpoints right now, but yeah, I just kind of wanted to say that it's not that this work isn't being done. The visibility may just look a bit different. But for example, I mentioned Gasworks in my section of the guide, and the curator Rosa, like she's knowledgeable about blockchain, you know, she's worked with so many artists who are looking at technology. These curators who work with artists in residence, for example, they're really sensitive to the ways that artists are leaning into different kind of mediums. Just because that work is entitled digital art curator doesn't mean that they're not looking at that. So I just also wanted to put that forward, that it's not, you know, a cultural desert for digital art.
I think that's so important, Clara. I recently didn't get a job for a digital curator, producer or something, because the feedback I got, they didn't interview, and I'm like, I didn't expect you definitely give me it, but I certainly expected an interview, and with my background. And they were like, oh, well, we had so many applications, we just chose to interview people with digital in their job title. And I'm like, whoa, haven't we gone past that? I'm like, I'm a curator.
Wow.
I work with contemporary culture. It's like,
That's mental.
It was mental. And
Why would it feed into what you're saying, Clara? Slightly shoot myself in the foot, which is basically, and I'm speaking specifically to the kind of like blockchain native digital art collector that has a deep understanding of digital art and may have less of an understanding of the kind of wider ecosystem of contemporary art, which is to say, like, you know, it's great to go and hunt for all these kind of like digital art truffles around London, but at the same time, like, it's also great just to like go and see loads of galleries and see, you know, everything else that's being made, some of it digital, some of it not. And actually what that will do is, it may not mean that you're looking at pixels, but, you know, you may be looking at ways to kind of, I don't know, not make more sophisticated, but like, you know, ways just to kind of like broaden your eye. And I think that will just like, you know, London has such a great art scene. The majority of work made by artists, you know, who are under 50 will include some digital practice. And just viewing that and looking at the context will expose you to whole new things that will, you know, make you a better collector, critic, student, artist, whatever.
It's easily one of the biggest and one of the best culture capitals of the world. And yeah, which is why I think, Abigail, your point about music was really good too.
Yeah.
I mean, Luba Elliott brings like groups there to see like algo raves, because like algo raves have a history of development in the UK. And if you're watching or listening and feel overwhelmed, I think that's exactly what the guide is for. The guide is out already. So I think most, if not all, of what we talked about today is at some point in the guide. But well, yeah, thank you all so much. I hate to, we talk for hours, I think, but yeah, thank you all so much for doing the writing, for really helping out with that, and then also for this really great chat. I wish we could have talked longer, as always.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks,
Lovely.
Peter. Lovely
so
chatting to
much.
you all. Lovely to meet you,
So
Hannah.
nice speaking to
Cheers.
you all.
Bye. Bye.